Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Weekend Bible Study. We are recording episode 15 in the Deuteronomy series here in Sugar Land, Texas. Here in Houston it certainly is hot. These are the dog days of summer, but it looks like most of the country is experiencing record high temperatures as well. I hope you're able to stay cool wherever you're listening. This week in Houston we all witnessed the final landing of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. This marks the end of an era. 30 years of manned spaceflight. The Space Shuttle program was a remarkably successful program and was, of course, very closely associated with the NASA operations here in Houston. We'll all be watching to see what's next for NASA. Its future is somewhat uncertain, but it will be interesting to watch. As we get back to Deuteronomy, I'm amazed at how timeless so many of the themes and the instructions seem to be. Much of what we read could be taken from today's headlines. Clearly, there are lessons today for us in Deuteronomy, and I can't wait to get started. We have no questions, so after a short break, we'll get right into it. And it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you will obey the voice of the Lord your God. As you recall, in the last part of chapter 27, there were various curses recited by the Levites, and this was part of the program of entry, if you will, into the Promised Land. Chapter 28 is not setting up a program or a ceremony or a ritual, but changes things up a bit. Moses is now teaching and elaborating on both blessings and cursings in a lot more detail, and with a lot of eloquence and power. In many ways, this is a remarkable book, remarkable chapter, I should say, in the book of Deuteronomy. As one commentator put it, quote, in sustained declamatory power, it stands unrivaled in the New Testament, close quote. What I find interesting is that it reads very much like prophecy, but it's different in some important respects. The points here are not outcomes that are destined to occur. They don't have to occur. These are not inevitable outcomes. The outcomes were still up to the nation at this point. All they had to do was keep their part of the bargain, to be obedient to God. So let's read on. Verse 3. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, and the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your livestock, the increase of your cattle, and the flocks of your sheep. Blessed shall be your basket and your store. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. Verse 7, the Lord shall cause your enemies that rise up against you to be stricken before your face. They shall come out against you one way, and flee before you in 7 ways. Verses 3 through 7 outline some very encouraging blessings that will accrue if the people obey the covenant. They will be fruitful in the sense that they'll be blessed with many children and offspring. Their livestock will increase, which means they'll be wealthy. Livestock was wealth in that culture. Their storehouses will be full of food. There won't be hunger. There'll be great prosperity. When you go up and when you leave, you will prosper, meaning when you go to work and when you come home from work, you will prosper. Both your business and professional endeavors will prosper. And finally, when you go to battle, your enemies will be dazed and confused. They'll run in 7 different directions. And I've never been in combat, but it doesn't take much imagination to understand that when your enemy is confused and disoriented and in panic, that's a good thing. Just amazing blessings that were promised if they simply obeyed. Picking up in verse 8. The Lord shall command the blessing upon you in your storehouses and all that you set your hand to do. He shall bless you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The Lord shall establish you a holy people to himself, as he has sworn to you, if you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. And all the people of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and shall be afraid of you. This phrase, called by the name of the Lord, is very interesting. It's like a badge of ownership. Today we have surnames. My last name is Crow. It identifies me as part of the Crow family. Israel will be understood to be a special possession of God. Not literally called, the name of the nation was Israel, but in the sense that the prosperity and the protection that they are receiving from God will be so apparent to other nations that Israel really would be known and understood to be one nation under God. This reminds me of a story that, in fact, I just read to my children this week. The story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, or as my 8-year-old daughter likes to say, my shack, your shack, and a bungalow. This story you're familiar with was when these young men were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian captivity in the book of Daniel. And they were in trouble because they refused to bow down and worship the image of the king. And the king, of course, was enraged. Nebuchadnezzar ordered them to be thrown into a fiery furnace. But miraculously, the 3 men were saved. And Nebuchadnezzar, to his credit, had the wits to at least recognize that only an all-powerful God could have pulled off this miracle. And while he didn't become a believer at that point, he certainly understood the power. He recognized it. It was so apparent he couldn't deny it. And the persecution of those who would not worship idols was ended at that point. So that's a good example of how this can occur. That nations who don't necessarily believe and worship God will at least believe and recognize the power. It was so apparent, and it can actually cause fear and real awe in their enemies. And what an advantage that would have been to the nation. Again, all they had to do was obey, to uphold their part of the bargain. Verse 11. And the Lord shall make you abound in goods, in the fruit of your body, and in the fruit of your livestock, and in the fruit of your ground, and in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give you. The Lord shall open to you his good treasure, the heaven to give the rain to your land in its season, and to bless you in the work of your hand. And you shall loan to many nations, but shall not borrow. And the Lord shall make you the head and not the tail. And you shall be always above, and you shall not be beneath, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, to observe and to do them. Rain in due season. This is one of the things that's promised. Here in South Texas, we are currently experiencing drought conditions, and from what I understand, many parts of the country are. And when rain does not come when it's supposed to, at the right time and the right amounts, bad things occur, and occur relatively quickly. You know the old expression, April showers bring May flowers. Well, the showers have to come in April. They have to come at the right times and the right amounts. Right now we're experiencing, where I live, water rationing. But all that means is that we're not supposed to water our lawns on certain days. It's not to the point that the drought is causing real hardship. But it is a reminder that if God were to simply withhold rain, that would be sufficient. That by itself would be sufficient to set a nation on a pretty quick path to ruin. I won't turn there, but when you have a chance, you might refer to Zechariah chapter 14, where a very interesting prophecy is made, that God says if the nations among all the families of the world do not come up to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, what will happen? What will be the curse? God will simply withhold rain. And that's the kind of curse that might not be readily apparent. It's not like you would notice within 24 hours what had occurred. It would be a quiet type of a curse, if you will. Not very spectacular at first. But it wouldn't take long. How long would it take if a nation literally did not receive a drop of rain, that nation would be in a desperate state of affairs? Of course, it would depend on a lot of things, on the water stores, the aquifers, all sorts of factors would play in. But the point is understood. It wouldn't take long. And we can see this promised as a curse if Israel would not obey, but conversely as a blessing, the rain would come in due season if Israel simply obeyed. The other thing that strikes me about this passage we just read is the promise that if Israel was obedient, they would be a lender nation, not a creditor nation. You will be a lender, not a borrower. You'll be the head, not the tail. Very interesting, and I will come back to this point later, but I just wanted to point it out now because in light of so much of what's going on today in our nation and really around the world, this seems particularly salient. Verse 14, "And you shall not go aside from the words which I command you today, to the right hand or to the left, to go after gods to serve them. And it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe and do all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." So we're switching gears now. We've been discussing the blessings, but now we're reminded again and in more detail than was discussed in chapter 27 about the curses that will come as a result of disobedience. Verse 15, "And it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe and to do all the commandments and his statutes, which I command you today, all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your store. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body, and the fruit of your land, and the increase of your livestock, and the flocks of your sheep. Cursed shall be when you go in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will send you cursing and vexation and rebuke and all that you set your hand to do until you are destroyed, and until you perish quickly because of the wickedness of your doings by which you have forsaken me." Notice how these verses, in particular verses 15 through 19, closely mirror verses 3 through 6. Whereas one states the blessings that will happen and occur, the other state the curses, but it's just sort of the mirror image. Moses spends the remainder of the chapter, really about 38 verses, elaborating on the curses in a lot of graphic detail. Some of this material is rated PG-13 for intense subject matter, and it is very sobering. Let's continue in verse 21. "The Lord shall make the pestilence cling to you until he has consumed you from off the land where you go to possess it. The Lord shall strike you with lung disease and with fever and with an inflammation and with an extreme burning and with the sword and with blasting and with mildew. And they shall pursue you until you perish. And the heavens over your head shall be bronze, and the earth that is under you iron." Some of these curses sound a lot like some of the things that occurred during the plagues in Egypt. For instance, the extreme burning seems evocative of the boils that plagued the Egyptians. These events in Egypt would have been within the national memory of many of the Israelites that would have been hearing this from Moses. The mildew is sometimes translated as both blight and mildew. This refers to disease and disasters that can affect crops. The mildew would be a result of excessive humidity. The blight would have been a result of excessive dryness. Remember back to the blessing that if you are obedient, there will be rain in due season. If you are not, you will not have that rain in due season. And what is the natural result of that? Blight and mildew on crops. This is one of the themes throughout this chapter, how the agricultural pursuits will either be blessed or be cursed to some degree in correlation to the obedience of the nation. When I look at our current situation in the United States, one of the things that I've heard many speak about when trying to put a positive spin, if you will, on our current situation as a nation is to remind us of the fact that we still are the world's breadbasket. We have a remarkable agricultural capability in this nation, and we haven't even tapped into it fully. And I suppose the theory goes that if things really got bad, we would at least always have the advantage of being able to feed ourselves. And this is true, and it's a great blessing. But as you read through this part of the book of Deuteronomy, we need to be reminded that this is not something that can be taken for granted. All it would take is for a season for the rain to not come when it's supposed to come. And something that we take for granted would be gone. Verse 23 makes an interesting statement. It says, "Your heavens over your head shall be bronze, and the earth under you iron." I can't be certain, but I believe this is referring to the fact that if you have a prolonged drought, and in essence the atmosphere has been deprived of water for so long, that the horizons will look different, the land will become hard as iron, unfit for crops or for agricultural purposes. I think this is just simply referring to the way the environment will appear different after a prolonged drought. If you have any other thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear them. Verse 24. The Lord shall make the rain of your land powder and dust. It shall come down from the heavens upon you until you are destroyed. Verse 24, I wonder if this is referring to something God will actually send, or if it's just really referring to the result of prolonged drought. We've seen this in our own national experience in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, where great dust storms were stirred up because the land was so dry over such a prolonged period. It's really not clear to me, but it's certainly something that would have been very, very traumatic and very devastating. Verse 25. The Lord shall cause you to be stricken before your enemies, and you shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and you shall become abhorrent unto the kingdom of the earth. Notice that just the opposite will occur from when you are blessed. When you are blessed, your enemies will run away in panic and disarray. The curse will be that your armies will be in confusion and chaos. Verse 26. And your dead bodies shall be food to all the birds of the air and to the beasts of the earth, and no man shall frighten them away. Not to dwell on this, because this is something that is hard and difficult to think about. But certainly those who have been in places like Haiti after the earthquake, or in places like Southeast Asia after tsunami, they've experienced this and seen just how horrific it is. And this is predicted as an outcome ultimately for Israel if they are not obedient. Verse 27. The Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt, and with the hemorrhoids, and with the scab, and with the itch of which you cannot be healed. The Lord shall strike you with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. And you shall grope at noonday as the blind gropes in darkness, and you shall not prosper in your ways, and you shall always be pressed down and spoiled forever, and no man will save you. The phrases, you will be struck down with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart, and you shall grope at noonday as the blind gropes in the darkness. I find these to be the most menacing and chilling verses in all of the passages we've read today. It's almost as if God is saying, the situation will be so grave that your best and your brightest will go to work on the problem, but it will not be solved. And that's pretty disconcerting. It's kind of like watching a disaster movie. And in the Hollywood version, the hero is always smart enough and brave enough to find a way of escape. But in Israel's reality, this situation would be so bad, there would be no escape. Your best efforts would not be good enough. Your destiny would not be your own. That would be the most discouraging situation to be in, the most hopeless situation to be in, to know that there really is not a way of escape. And something Israel was warned would happen. Verse 30. You shall become engaged to a wife, and another man shall lie with her. You shall build a house, and you shall not live in it. You shall plant a vineyard, and you shall not gather the grapes of it. Your ox shall be slain before your eyes, and you shall not eat of it. Your donkey shall be violently taken away from before your face, and shall not be restored to you. Your sheep shall be given to your enemies, and you shall have none to rescue them. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, and your eyes shall look and fail for them all the day long. And there shall not be any power in your hand. The fruit of your land and all your labor shall be eaten up by a nation which you do not know, and you shall only be oppressed and crushed always. And you shall be driven mad, because that which you shall see with the sight of your eyes. Verses 30 through 34 summarize some of the effects of foreign occupation. we have been very blessed in this country and really in most of the English-speaking world to have not had to experience and live under foreign oppression and to live in relative freedom. But I know, and I think many of us know, people who have not been so blessed all of their lives. One person that comes to mind is my wife's maternal grandfather, who grew up in the Ukraine. And he was fortunate enough to immigrate to Canada after World War II. But he lived for a time until he was a grown man, lived under the oppression of Joseph Stalin's communist regime in the Soviet Union. And we know from history that Joseph Stalin was in many ways responsible for much more carnage and much more evil than perhaps even Adolf Hitler. He doesn't seem to get as much notoriety for that, but he was a very evil, sinister figure in history. And I can remember my wife's grandfather telling us stories in his broken English of some of the oppression that he experienced living under a communist regime. And one of the things that he remembered, and he could tell the story literally 80 years later and still be in tears. He'll be 100 soon. So 80 years earlier, more, he can remember stories with tears about how the communists would come and just take things from their home, including their livestock. And that would have been very important to a poor family just barely scratching out a living in the Ukraine. We've been blessed not to have to live under those kinds of circumstances, most of us. But we know others who haven't been so fortunate. And Israel is being warned here that if they don't keep up their end of the bargain, these types of atrocities and difficulties would occur. And it's not something any of us would ever want to experience, and certainly something you would have thought they would have understood they didn't want to experience either. We'll take a short break and pick back up in verse 35. The Lord shall strike you in the knees and in the legs with an evil ulcer that cannot be healed from the sole of your feet to the top of your hand. The Lord shall bring you and your king, which you shall set over you, to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. Note that in verse 36, God references the fact that there will be a king. At this point, that was not God's intention for the nation. He is really prophesying another part of the curse, if you will, is that the less obedient they are to the covenant, the more necessary it would be to have a king. God's intention was that the people would be lightly governed and have a very high degree of personal freedom. But the less personal responsibility the nation shows, the more necessary it is for a king, for a strong hand to come in and impose law and order, if you will. Just a subtle thing that can be missed if you don't read that carefully. And then also, they'll be forced to serve other gods of wood and stone. We see this very clearly, for instance, in the story I referenced earlier about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how their nation was in the Babylonian captivity and forced to worship idols. So, just another example of how prophetic, really, this whole chapter 28 in Deuteronomy is. Verse 37, And you shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all the nations where the Lord shall lead you. What's really being said here by Moses is that you will become a laughingstock among the nations, the butt of jokes. Human nature is such that, unfortunately, we sometimes like to watch those who are mighty fall, and we get a certain amount of enjoyment out of that, unfortunately. But even the nation's pride will not be spared. They'll become a laughingstock, something that would be very difficult to experience, especially if you've been on top. Verse 38, You shall carry much seed out into the field, and shall gather little in, for the locust shall eat it. You shall plant vineyards and dress them, but shall neither drink the wine nor gather, for the worm shall eat it. You shall have olive trees throughout all your coast, but you shall not anoint yourself with the oil, for your olive trees shall drop off their fruit. You shall beget sons, daughters, but you shall not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. All your trees and the fruit of your land the locusts shall possess. Verses 38 through 42 continue to focus primarily on the negative impact on agriculture. And we've talked about earlier, if you're in a drought situation, so many of these things are just the inevitable result of that. But let's look at verse 43. The stranger dwelling among you shall get up above you very high, and you shall come down very low. He shall loan to you, and you shall not loan to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail. How is it that a nation could come to be dominated by strangers? This almost sounds a little different than the situation where a foreign power has taken over, because Israel is instructed throughout Deuteronomy to be good to strangers. Strangers are to be welcomed if they're willing to abide by the basic aspects of the society. They're to be welcomed, to be treated well. But how is it that strangers could quietly become so dominant in a society? It's predicted as one of the curses that would accrue to Israel if they were disobedient to God's laws. Well, think about some of the other curses that we've talked about. If you are not faithful to God, the fruit of your womb will be cursed. In other words, birth rates will decline. To put it in modern vernacular, your demographics will change. Some modern examples are very apparent. If you look, for instance, in Europe today, native Europeans are by and large not having children. But the immigrant populations, primarily the Muslims from places like North Africa and different parts of the world, are coming into the countries and are growing. They're having children. And if you look at the current birth rates, in a generation or two, certain countries in Europe will have possibly a majority Muslim population. Now, without delving into all the ramifications of that, it's fair enough to say that those nations will be very different under that circumstance. They will be culturally different. It will not be the same. And certainly at that point, the strangers will be in a dominant position. And how did it happen? Without firing a single shot. Simply the birth rates had declined among the native population, though that blessing had been removed, so to speak, and the immigrant populations were continuing to have children and to grow. Just an interesting thing to think about, because we can see that even in the modern world, how that can happen. In verse 44, we're also reminded that one of the curses is that the native population will no longer lend, but borrow from the strangers. And we see this occurring even in modern times and how it can hurt a nation. For instance, in this country, the United States, we owe so much debt to China that it really is starting to impact our foreign affairs and the way that we are viewed in the world. If the Chinese wanted to meet with the president today, you can be assured he would clear his calendar. And why would that be? Because we owe them so much money. The same reason you would meet with your mortgage lender if he wanted to meet with you is the reason that we have to defer to the Chinese in so many ways. We owe them so much money. And it's a type of bondage. They have a degree of control over us that is not helpful. And we've largely financed our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq on money borrowed from China. Verse 45. And all these curses shall come on you, and shall pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. And they shall be on you for a sign and a wonder, and on your seed forever. Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, which the Lord shall send against you in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in the want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord shall bring a nation against you from afar, and from the end of the earth as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you do not understand. A nation fierce of countenance, who shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. Nations that would later overtake Israel, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, were very brutal, and some of the atrocities that the nation experienced are well described here. These things were really predicted here in Deuteronomy 28. These captors would not be humane. These were not benevolent masters. There was no Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe like the Allies did after World War II. There was no General MacArthur to stick around and rebuild Japan as our nation did. These would be very hard-hearted, difficult captivities. And it was something that did, unfortunately, occur later as we read throughout the prophets and the book of Kings, for instance, and different places in the rest of the Old Testament. Verse 51, "And he shall eat the fruit of your livestock and the fruit of your land until you are destroyed. He shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, neither the increase of your livestock or flocks of your sheep, until he has destroyed you. And he shall besiege you within all your gates until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all the land. And he shall besiege you within all gates throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you. And you shall eat the fruit of your own body and the flesh of your sons and your daughters, which the Lord your God has given you in the siege, and the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you. The man that is tender among you shall be, and very delicate, even his eye also shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the rest of his children which he has left, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he has nothing left to him in the siege. And the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you in all your gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, who would not have ventured to set a sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and tenderness. Her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one, who comes out from between her feet, and toward her children, whom she shall bear. For she shall eat them secretly for lack of all things in the siege, and anguish with which your enemy shall distress you within your gates. If you will not observe to do all these words of the law that are written in the books, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God." What we've just read is chilling, and it's unpleasant and difficult to even contemplate. What Moses is saying is that even the mild-mannered, in other words, the one you would least expect, will be capable of some of the most atrocious acts as a result of the difficulties that would come. These times would be so horrific that people would do the unthinkable. I think there's a lesson in this, perhaps, for us. I've sometimes, even in my own life, I've been guilty of, and I know others have as well, of being very cavalier about what they would or wouldn't do. I would never do that, or I couldn't understand how someone could ever do this or that. And it's appropriate to have firm convictions. I'm not saying that we should be uncommitted or indecisive about what is right and what is wrong. But I think we need to be a little bit careful, though, about assuming that we're incapable of sinful or horrific acts. Unfortunately, until we're in the situation, we can't know for certain how we will react. And God is saying here, even the delicate person, even the person you wouldn't expect, if pushed to that point, might be capable of some very horrific things. Let's take a look at 2 Kings chapter 6, just to flesh out this point a little bit more. We're going to break into a story during the time of Elisha and King Jehoram of Israel, who was, of course, an evil king, and read about the circumstances there, that how they got so bad that the very things that were predicted in Deuteronomy were occurring. Let's pick up in 2 Kings 6, verse 24. "And it came to pass after this, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his army and went up and laid siege to Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 silver pieces." In other words, things had gotten so bad that they were having to resort to eating non-livestock for food. And it was really, and the prices were exceedingly high. It was a very desperate situation. Verse 26. And as the king of Israel was passing by upon the wall, a woman cried to him, saying, Help me, my lord, O king. And he said, If the Lord does not help you, from where shall I help you? Out of the barn floor? Out of the winepress? In other words, woman, if I had food to distribute to the people, I would have done it. What can I do for you? Verse 28. And the king said to her, What ails you? And she said, This woman said to me, Give me your son, so that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. And we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the other day, Give your son, that we may eat him. And she has now hidden her son. Remarkable to think of this occurring, but the women had entered into an arrangement where they would eat each other's children. The cannibalism had taken hold in the city. That's how desperate the situation was. And now, remarkably still, they had asked the king to intervene in this unbelievable scenario. I won't take the time to read the rest of this account in 2 Kings chapter 6. Just to give you the highlights, the king and Elisha have some interaction, and God does intervene to relieve some of the suffering of the people. Another example of God's mercy, even when the people aren't fully deserving of it. But the point here is that the events described in Deuteronomy 28 as cursings that would happen if the nation was disobedient, those very things did actually occur many, many years later. And as horrible as this is to believe, it's easy to read this type of thing and say, how could this ever happen? And yet when we look even today, is it really so hard to believe? Just in the last couple of weeks, we as a nation have been mesmerized, unfortunately, by the trial in Florida involving Casey Anthony. I mean, I think most of you are familiar with the basic details of that trial, so I won't rehearse them. But we have a situation where it appears that a mother either killed her child or at the very least showed great neglect of this child, all to facilitate her partying lifestyle. In some ways, that's more despicable and evil than someone who would devolve into cannibalism to survive, versus someone that would allow this kind of distress to occur to a child simply to facilitate their lifestyle. Which is the more evil act? Is it really so hard to believe these things could happen when we look at the state of the world today? It's very unpleasant to think about, so I'll move on. But it's something that should be very sobering. Verse 59. The Lord your God will make your plagues extraordinary, and the plagues of your seed great, and persistent plagues with evil and long-lasting sickness. Also he will bring on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they will cling to you. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, the Lord will bring them upon you until you are destroyed. In other words, not just the diseases and the afflictions you've heard of, but even those you haven't heard of will be coming your way if you don't uphold your part of the bargain. Verse 62. And you shall be left few in number, whereas you were as the stars of the heavens for multitude, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. And it shall come to pass, as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to nothing. And you shall be plucked from off the land where you go to possess it. And the Lord will scatter you among all people, from the one end of the earth even to the other. And you shall serve other gods there, wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. Verse 64, we know, unfortunately, really did come to pass for the nation. Eventually they became unfaithful, they broke the covenant, and in dispersions, beginning with the Assyrians and later with the Babylonian captivity, they were literally dispersed to all corners of the world, and with some limited exceptions, largely lost their identity. Unfortunately, these very things came to pass. Verse 65. And among these nations you shall find no ease, neither shall the sole of your feet have rest, But the Lord your God shall give you there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you shall fear day and night, and shall have no assurance of your life. And all the morning you shall say, Oh, that it were the evening. And in the evening you shall say, Oh, that it were the morning. For the fear of your heart, with which you shall fear, and for the sight of your eyes, which you shall see. Verse 68, And the Lord shall bring you into Egypt again with ships, by the way of which I said to you, You shall see it no more again. And there you shall be sold to your enemies, for men slaves and women slaves, and no man shall buy you. Verse 68 is kind of the culmination of all these cursings. Moses is telling the people that if you disobey, if you break this covenant, you're going to end up right back where you started from. Maybe not literally in Egypt, although in some cases that perhaps would have occurred, but certainly figuratively back into bondage. And in fact, the bondage would be so bad, your situation will be so bad, your plight, that you may not even be purchased to be a slave. Instead, you may be sent into more of a communal situation to work in salt mines or to do the really hard labor, the difficult things. Even among the hierarchy of slaves, you will be at the bottom. It's not a situation that was going to be very pleasant. But God warned them. He wasn't hiding the ball here. He laid it out. Moses in great detail lays it out. If you do the very thing that's good for you anyway, the thing you ought to be doing anyway, obey God's laws, obey the covenant, blessings will come your way. They'll come out of nowhere, so to speak. They'll just flow right to you. But by comparison, the cursings will come just as quickly if you are disobedient. Well, this was no doubt difficult subject matter we covered today. It wasn't pleasant, most of it, except for the first few verses in chapter 28. The rest dealt with curses and challenges that would occur if the nation was disobedient under the covenant. And just as they needed to be reminded that sin and disobedience is a serious matter with serious consequences, I suppose it's good for us to be sobered by that fact on occasion as well, although it's not pleasant to dwell on it, admittedly. I know many of you have been asked, I know I have, and we've had to consider a very basic question. Why is there so much evil and difficulty in the world? As I've gotten older, I've come to look at it a different way. When I think about how delicate, how fragile our existence is, and consider also the depravity of human nature, I suppose the real miracle is that there's not more evil. In the United States, we've been particularly blessed that we've been isolated from so much evil. Now, there have been flare-ups, no doubt. We think of the attacks on 9/11. But it's a fair question or a fair observation to note that in a world where there's so much evil and so many that would do harm if they could, to ask the question, why don't things like that occur even more often? And the answer is, I believe, God's grace. I think to a large extent, especially in certain parts of the world, like the United States and other parts of the world that have been blessed to have a degree of protection, a hedge, I believe, that God has put around us, that has protected us from not all evil, but so much evil that could occur. It's God's grace. It's like the old song that we sing, America the Beautiful. One of the most moving lines is, God shed His grace on thee. It's God's grace that holds back evil. And to the extent a nation is obedient to God's principles, I think God's hedge remains more firmly in place. And to the extent we disobey God's principles, perhaps that grace is removed to varying degrees. We should all be very grateful that we've been so blessed, but be mindful that it's not something we can take for granted. I'm so glad you could join us this week. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to email those to richardcrow@borntowin.net. That's richardcrow@borntowin.net. Crow is C-R-O-W. And I look forward to hearing from some of you. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.